Alrighty, welcome back, friends. So moving on from salinity for just a little bit, we're going to move into some other components of seawater and continuing on our talk of chemistry. So we know that our atmosphere is made up of gases, right? We breathe it, right? We breathe gas. We are not living in an aquarium, right? We're not breathing water. We are breathing air and gases. And it's really important to now know that the gases in our atmosphere can actually then dissolve down into the oceans and can become part of the ocean. The ocean is actually a huge carbon sink. So we rely a lot on the ocean to take in a lot of that carbon that we keep on keeping on emitting. So let's get into it. So what's pretty cool is that atmospheric gases can dissolve within seawater and are not just distributed at the surface. They sink down into the water because water is extremely malleable. It's moving a lot, right? Whether or not it's at the surface or some deep ocean currents, or waves or anything like that, there's a lot of mixing going on. And because of that, then, the concentrations of these various gases can be dissolved into the water and moved to every different part of the water. Also, oxygen and carbon dioxide play very, very important roles in the ocean because it's necessary for all life, right? So these biological activities modify concentrations at various depths. So if there's a lot of CO2 uptake of the surface, by plankton or, seaweeds or seagrass or whatever, there can be a lot more CO2 uptake there and maybe even oxygen release, right? So when plants photosynthesize, they intake CO2 and the sun's energy, and then they give us oxygen. I'll try and find a video of some underwater plants that you can literally see oxygen bubbles coming off of the leaves. It's actually pretty neat. And, there's other biological activities as well. Things are dying, things are eating, things are pooping. A lot of these things can help mix these molecules into the deeper oceans. And there's only a maximum amount of gas that can be held within a solution. So this is called the saturation concentration. And this value changes in respect to temperature, salinity, and pressure. So it will also vary between different gases as well. So say, for example, kind of a way to think about this is I have my hydro flask, and this hydro flask is only 40 ounces, right? So it can only hold 40 ounces worth of liquid. It can't hold any more. It can certainly hold less. Actually, I've been really bad and haven't drank much water today. I came here with an empty bottle and it's still kind of empty. I need to fill it. So it can hold 40 ounces, doesn't mean that it is holding 40 ounces, right? As opposed to this pint glass here that's holding my pens. Pint is only 16 ounces. So it can hold up to 16, but nothing more than that, right? So that's kind of a way to visualize the saturation concentration. Turns out it's actually similar in the atmosphere as well. So in terms of holding water vapor. So the warmer air temperatures can potentially hold more moisture. So again, it's different for every gas. So it can also vary. And remember, the calcium compensation depth that we talked about with sediments, right? Calcium can only exist above 4,500 meters. It starts to break down at that compensation depth. So that's kind of another way to perhaps imagine that. So if we were to compare the gases of the atmosphere, what their concentrations are in the atmosphere versus what they are in the oceans, it's actually a pretty interesting contrast. So first, before we move on, think about what the gases are that make up our atmosphere. We talked about it at the beginning of the semester, and we're bringing it up again. It's going to be an ever long thing that we talk about. But just recall what those are. Think. Correct. So it'll be nitrogen and oxygen make up most of our gases in the atmosphere, and then we have some little buddies hanging out in here too, right? So we got CO2, argon, helium, neon, etc. So what this table is showing is the percentage by volume in the atmosphere, so our atmospheric concentration. So we know that nitrogen consists of about 78% of our atmosphere, and oxygen is about 21%, and argon hangs out at about 1%. And I had to make this change here, this note, because even though your book's not super old, this value has not been updated. So it's not 0.03 anymore, it's 0.04%, which is the same thing as 400 parts per million. But then if we compare that value of what's in the atmosphere versus what is in the surface seawater, that's a big thing to note here, and with the particular salinity and water temperature, because again, these concentrations can then vary, right? Because that saturation concentration. So even though nitrogen consists of 78% of our atmosphere, it only consists of about 48% of our surface seawater, whereas oxygen, even though it's only 21% of the volume in our atmosphere, it's 36% in the surface water. Surface water is very, very important here, right? And then CO2 at the surface is only about 15%, with our other constituents in there as well, our other molecules. But then if we were to consider the whole ocean, the total volume, see how much more nitrogen just gets used, right? So it's not really stored in the oceans. Neither is oxygen. Only 11% for nitrogen and 6% for oxygen. It's pretty wild. And then carbon dioxide is hanging out here at 83%. So really, seriously, the big take-home point is CO2 makes up such a minuscule amount of our atmosphere and really dominates in terms of volume in the oceans. This again goes back to this idea that the ocean is a huge carbon sink, and it's basically Mother Nature's way of taking in all that CO2 that we are releasing. And there's some consequences to that, actually. So this brings us to the carbon cycle. And before we get to the carbon cycle, our little fun factsies for the day. The movie that I went and saw over the weekend, or on Thursday, I guess I should say, was the new Ant-Man movie. Very entertaining. I don't know if good is the right word for it, but it was very entertaining. So I recommend it if you're into the superhero Marvel movies. It's just CGI madness, but it's still really cool. And Paul Rudd, I mean, come on. Okay, so moving on to the real stuff. So this brings us to the carbon cycle, or what's also known as the biological pump. We will revisit this idea when we get back to the biology section, or to the biology section, but it's really important to bring this up now, and how and why CO2 is affecting our oceans. So the ocean takes up roughly 1.6 to 3 billion metric tons of CO2 per year. The transfer of CO2 to organic molecules by photosynthesis results in added CO2 to the middle and deeper oceans because the material sinks and decays. So what this means is plankton and any sort of other sea plant, whether it be kelp or mangrove trees or other sorts of seaweed, sea grasses, are a huge thing here as well. They take in all that CO2 because they're photosynthesizing, right? So they take in CO2 and sunlight and provide for us oxygen and sugar, right? So with that, the plankton are either eaten or broken down by bacteria, because once they die, or they're eaten a lot of times by like really, really big animals, aka whales. And then that goes through the whale's digestion system, and then they poop it out. Or whales die. All things die, but eventually they'll sink down to the bottom. And so all of that carbon then gets stored in the bottom of the ocean, generally. And then there's other processes too that can occur here. So plankton in particular are the big players here. They are responsible for about 40% of Earth's total production of organic material via this process of photosynthesis. 90% of which is recycled in the upper levels, and the remaining 10% gets used up in the middle levels, and then the remaining little itty bitty bit is broken down by bacteria or consumed by bottom-dwelling animals or preserved in sediment. So basically a way to think about this little blurb here is that plankton, I mean, they do play a huge role in everything, and a lot of that plankton gets used up or eaten or taken up somehow in the upper levels of the ocean, and a very, very, very minute amount actually makes it down and preserved in sediment. Like maybe of like your whole body, think of your whole entire body, only like one hangnail of your fingernails will make it down to the actual bottom of the ocean and be stored there. Otherwise, it's being used up within the water column itself. So if we were to look at the carbon cycle a little bit deeper, we'll start here on the left. So each box is showing a reservoir or holder of carbon, and each arrow is showing the process of the exchange of CO2 from one reservoir to another. And what we can see here is by many, many, many orders of magnitude, the intermediate, so the middle and the deep ocean, is such a huge carbon reservoir by 37,000 units versus like 900 in the surface ocean, or 3 in the marine biota, or 829 in the atmosphere, right? So it's the big thing here is it's really, really used or stored in the intermediate and deep ocean areas, and really a small amount of that is stored as sediment. So it's kind of wild. Another big thing here to keep in mind is that vegetation and soil and detritus, which basically means poop in a more scientific term, I guess, a lot of carbon is stored here. Like we want to plant trees for a reason, right? And plants, because they intake that CO2. That CO2 will then penetrate into the soil. I do also want to point out that the fossil fuels and cement production, this value of 7.8 is vastly underestimated. This is very, very, very underestimated, unfortunately. And then the graph here on the right-hand side is looking at this blue line is oxygen, and that's the top y or x-axis, and the pink dotted line is carbon dioxide on the bottom x-axis, with depth on our y-axis. So the surface of the ocean is at the top, and about 1,200 meters down is here at the bottom. So the main take-home point here is that there's not as much CO2 in the surface water, but as you go further down, there's a greater concentration of CO2, whereas oxygen starts as rather abundant and then gets used up to pretty minuscule levels, and then kind of regains its dominance, not dominance, but it regains concentrations after about 1,000 meters or so. So this all of this information has huge impacts on the chemistry of water. So in the next video, we'll talk about this problem that is occurring with too much CO2 in the atmosphere as well as in the ocean. So thanks for watching, and stay tuned for the next video.